So let's take a look at the first row on the procedures for disciplinary violations. The first row is about a short-term removal, which means not more than 10 consecutive days of suspension, or for the case of a special ed student, not more than 10 cumulative days. This is not considered a change of placement. There are no services required, and the district is not required to provide services, but is required to notify the parents before the suspension, and the parents must be given a chance to have an informal hearing before the suspension. Now the next row is just a little bit different, but not really a whole lot. Now we've hit the 11th day, so what do? We do not have to have an IEP meeting yet, but the child must be given services so that they continue to make progress toward meeting their IEP goals. We also need to take a look at all of the suspensions that the student has had and decide, are they substantially similar? If they are, then we need to look at doing an FBA or doing a behavioral intervention plan to help the student learn how to deal with this type of behavior. We also need to look at the length of each removal, the total amount of time the student has been removed. This includes partial days, which are counted as full days. And we need to look at how close together the removals were to one another. If they were substantially close together, can this actually be termed a temporary change in placement? But overall, the most important thing for us to remember is that services must be given to that child so that they're still participating in the general education curriculum, still doing the work that they would have regularly been doing, and that they're still making progress toward their IEP goals. Now when we look at the next row, this is a removal for more than 10 consecutive days, or another removal that accumulates in more than 10 school days for our special ed students. On the day of this removal, the parents have to be notified, and they must be given a copy of their parental rights. Within 10 school days, we must have an IEP meeting. Now, prior written notice still needs to be given to the parents, but only 24 hours ahead in this case. And at this IEP meeting, the team will determine the services that will be provided, and if this behavior is a manifestation of the child's disability. For example, does a student get stressed and act out when they're stressed? Is this noted on the IEP? Was this behavior that resulted in them being expelled? If any of this occurs, or if it's determined that the school did not implement the IEP correctly, then the conduct of the student must be determined to be a manifestation of the child's disability. Now, if the behavior does stem from the disability, they go straight back to their original placement in the schools. The school conducts a functional behavioral assessment for the behavior in question, and the school implements a behavioral intervention plan, or they rework the old one so that it addresses the behavior in question. There are a couple of other options, though. First, the parent and the schools could agree to a different placement for this student. Or the school could ask the process hearing officer to order a 45 school day interim alternative educational setting if the school can show that maintaining the current placement is substantially likely to result in injury to the child or others. And again, this is a direct quote from page 210 of the Kansas Special Ed Process Handbook. But what do we do if it's determined that it's not a manifestation of the disability? Well, we take another look at the behavior that got the student in trouble. Did it violate the Code of Student Conduct? We look again at whether it is or isn't a manifestation of their disability. We need to be sure about this. Then we think, how would the disciplinary procedures be applied to students without disabilities? And are we planning on applying them the same way for this student? This child must still receive educational services, even though the behavior was not due to their disability. Now, the parents do not have to consent to this change in placement because it's not disability related. But the IEP team still determines services necessary to have the student participate in the general education curriculum and still make progress toward their IEP goals. And, maybe we need to do a functional behavioral assessment and a behavioral intervention plan to make sure that this student is receiving help in changing the behavior that got them in this problem. The school might need to have the district's disciplinary hearing officer make the final decision on what disciplinary action should be taken. In this case, the school sends the disciplinary hearing officer all of the information, including special education records and discipline records of the student, and the hearing officer makes the final decision. Remember, though, that any placement the student incurs the student has to be given a free and appropriate public education, which means they still have to be given services so that they can make progress toward their IEP goals. Let's take a look at the fourth row, 45 days of alternative education setting. There's a phrase in here that we're going to use, which is at school. For the Code of Student Conduct, it means 3 different things. It means physically being on the school premises during the school day. It also means being on school property not during the school day. So let's just say they're hanging out at the football field Saturday night after the game. Finally, at school includes being at a school function, and this function is under the jurisdiction of the school district or the State Board of Education. Now, maybe this means they're riding a bus to or from a school event. Okay? And this student who's broken the Code of Student Conduct can be suspended up to 45 school days, whether or not it's a manifestation of their disability. If it is a manifestation of their disability, then an interim alternative educational setting will be established. Under these conditions, you must still have an IEP meeting to do the following things: to make a manifestation determination, determine if this behavior is really related to the disability, to determine the interim alternative educational settings and services, to determine if the functional behavioral assessment or the behavior intervention plan are appropriate or if they need to be reworked, and to provide notice of the parent's rights. Even for such severe offenses, the student still has the right to a free, appropriate public education. This means that services start immediately. They start on the first day that the decision is made for an IAES. The student must still be allowed to participate in the general educational curriculum, and they must still be making progress toward their IEP goals. Now, there's a lot to consider when suspending a child with a disability. For example, are we suspending this student for the rest of his or her cumulative 10 days while we decide on the alternative placement? We have to start services on day 11. We think about, is the FBA right? What about the BIP? We need to fix them to make sure they are still right for this student. Then, did we give parents their parental rights information? Do they know that they can appeal our decisions? But don't get overwhelmed with it. Just follow the process. And remember that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. So, let's talk about appeals. Now, the parents have decided at this point that they do not agree with the school's decision about their child. They could disagree either on the disciplinary placement or the manifestation determination. The parents have the right of an expedited due process hearing, and this hearing does not stop the school from asking for a temporary restraining order or an injunction when necessary. The schools also have the right to request an expedited due process hearing if they believe that keeping the student in their current placement is substantially likely to end up in someone getting hurt. But back to the parents. Once the schools receive the notice of the parent's due process complaint, they have 1 week to schedule a resolution meeting, unless the parents and the school agree in writing to waive the resolution meeting, or they agree to use the mediation process instead. That's 1 week, and then a meeting. When the parent or the school appeal a disciplinary placement or the result of the manifestation determination, the child remains in the interim alternative educational setting determined by the IEP team, pending the decision of the hearing officer or until the expiration of the time of that disciplinary removal, whichever occurs first, unless the parent and the school agree otherwise. So there are only 2 reasons for an expedited due process hearing. The parents disagree with something that's been done, or the school thinks it's not safe to bring the student back. In either of these cases, either parties may request an expedited due process hearing. Once this has been requested, there are a few possible outcomes. The hearing officer could return the child to placement they were removed from, essentially their IEP placement. They could order a change in placement to an appropriate interim alternative educational setting for no more than 45 days. The officer could order an additional 45 days of IAES, or the officer can uphold the manifestation determination or the interim alternative educational placement. In effect, the officer could order no change. Whew. We are finished. We made it. It's a pretty complicated process, but that's all it is a process. Just follow the steps as they're outlined in the Kansas SPED Process Handbook, and you'll do fine. And that is the end. Oh, wait a minute. What about those kids who are not identified, but some people think that they might qualify for SPED services? Basically, it comes down to what the school district knew before the behavior that caused the disciplinary action. A district is said to know the child might need services if the school supervisors or administrators or the child's teacher has received in writing from the parents a note that the child needs SPED or related services. Also, the parents have requested an evaluation of the child. Or if the child's teacher or other school personnel have talked with the SPED director or other supervisory school personnel about specific concerns about a pattern of behaviors the child's exhibiting. And now we're back to the IDEA covering this student's suspension or expulsion. But the school is said to not have knowledge that a child is in need of services if the parents have not allowed an evaluation of the child, or they have received SPED or related services, or if the child has been evaluated and determined not to be a child with a disability. In this case, the school proceeds with disciplinary action without providing educational services for the student. So this takes us back to, is it fair? Is discipline under IDEA fair to all kids, not just kids with a disability? Well, remember this girl? This is Sandy. She's our general education girl who made a mistake and was disciplined under the school's discipline policy. And this is Sally. She is our girl who has a disability. Let's say she is deaf. She also made the same mistake and was disciplined under the rules of IDEA. Sandy decided to start a fight with another girl on the playground.